Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome back to the program Matt Castle, who is VP of Global Forwarding Products and Services at C.H. Robinson. Today, we're going to talk about looking ahead, important supply chain trends of 2017. Now, one of the great things about the supply chain logistics industry is that, there's so much going on all the time, whether it's, regulations or technology, or mergers and acquisitions, you name it. I mean, we could probably spend a whole week talking through all the possible trends that are happening in the industry. But today we're going to focus on some of the few high level trends, particularly those that Matt has from your seat, if you will, in his role and responsibilities there at C.H. Robinson and working with a variety of companies there. So. Great to have Matt on the program, bringing him back. And so thanks for taking the time to be with us today again, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Adrian, for having me back. It's good to be here.
Great. So, 2017's, has already started, right? We're already kind of mid-January, hard to believe, the time just keeps ticking by. So let's start with, a trend that's been going on, for quite some time, but, kind of continues and morph into different directions. And that's, globalization, right? When you look at recent developments, whether it's, Brexit, that happened last year, or you look at kind of the trade views of President-elect Trump, who's going to be, president starting tomorrow. Do companies need to approach globalization differently, moving forward, and kind of are the rules for success, the same or different than in the past?
Yeah, no, Adrian, great question. I mean, it's obviously a hot topic on a lot of fronts with a new administration coming in, and obviously what we saw happen with the Brexit, situation. And, I think where I would start is, globalization from, with any growth-oriented company represents a significant opportunity. But obviously it comes with a tremendous amount of associated risk for anybody who's looking to source product across multiple borders and, kind of outside their backyard, if you will. So, I think to answer your question directly, I think whatever has maybe been a recipe for success in the past is certainly not a guarantee as we go forward. I mean, I think we are clearly entering a time of some volatility in the marketplace that people need to be very cautious and aware of as we proceed here.
Yeah, no, I think that's my feeling as well. I mean, I think when you look at, particularly from a global trade standpoint, there seems to be, a little bit more of a protectionist type of, feeling, not only here in the U.S. with, some of the comments that have been made in terms of putting in import tariffs and things like that, but, even globally. I mean, I think you look at different countries and just the history of the past, few years seems to be kind of taking a more protectionist tone. So obviously that has implications in terms of where you source product, how you move product, things like that. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the challenging part though is, that door has of course been open. And so I think it's very much a reality that we're living in an environment today that is globalization. And so I think it's certainly hard to go back, I think, in some respects. And I think the tone, at least from my perspective, that you see playing out is how does each country position themselves in the best possible situation with these various trade deals that are being discussed. And I think there's some, obviously some logic and merit to that at the end of the day here as well. And, I guess, when I think through a little bit of kind of your question here, I mean, I think, naturally it's like, well, how do you combat some of this risk and some of these unknowns that exist out there? And, I know when I was on last, we talked pretty extensively about, building strong relationships across your supply chain. And I think if there's ever a time for that statement to hold true, it's in today's environment, without a doubt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of taking it down a level, when you look at what's been happening in the ocean shipping side with all the alliances and Hanjin, kind of dominated the news second half of last year, on the air forwarding side. I mean, how do you see that playing out, from a globalization standpoint, from a transportation through a transportation lens?
Well, it definitely represents challenges. Hanjin, towards the tail end of last year with their bankruptcy, certainly created some waves in their heavy trade lanes, Trans-Pacific in Europe, etc. And I think anytime you have something of that significance, it reshapes the landscape of not only the industry, but I think for those that were heavy players with a Hanjin, right? So you're invested with them, you have a relationship with them, and it almost has an effect where you've got to start over in some aspects. So, I think that just adds to the volatility that we're experiencing out there from, around this whole concept of globalization.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And kind of related, to globalization is trade agreements, right? With NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPPs, kind of still in the headlines and, some uncertainty there as well, right? I mean, why should shippers keep a pulse on what happens to NAFTA, TPP, and other trade agreements?
Yeah, I think bringing up NAFTA and TPP over the last, through the course of the election year that we went through, I think it does invoke a little bit of emotion on various different levels, depending on where you sit. But I think I think it's one of those things where. They're very real trade agreements that have been, a lot of people, a lot of energy have gone into these trade agreements. If I think of TPP as an example, it's taken 7 years to really hammer this deal out. Obviously, it's across 12 different countries. And I'll kind of draw it back a little bit into the NAFTA front. I mean, TPP, of course, includes Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. As part of the deal, and I think what TPP is attempting to do in many respects is learn from some of the challenges that we've experienced with NAFTA. And I think one of those examples I would pull out is the poultry industry, as part of NAFTA, did not have access into Canada, whereas now a part of TPP, that's opening those borders for those type of vendors. So I do think it is, intended to maybe evolve some of what existed as part of the NAFTA agreement. And I think to learn from some of those lessons. I think the other parts of TPP that sit out there is really trying to address some of the productivity and the efficiency and bring, I think, a higher level of standard to the customs process. So, TPP has an entire chapter dedicated to customs administration and trade facilitation, including goals of, working through a custom clearance within a 48-hour time frame. So I think there's a lot of good things that clearly sit underneath these deals. But, to my earlier comment, they're big, they're complex, they cover a lot of different areas in the trade. And again, I think if I play through the election year and again to the earlier commentary we had, I think everybody is trying to vie from a country perspective to put themselves in the best possible situation that's going to benefit, whether it's the US, Mexico, or Canada from that perspective.
Right. I mean, to me, it kind of boils down to, one of the things that I wrote about in my predictions for 2017. I think everything that's happening, particularly on the globalization front, whether you're talking about there's trade agreements, whether you're talking about whether there's going to be import tariffs, what action are we going to take with regards to, penalizing companies that, move their operations overseas, so on and so forth. I think it underscores the reality and the need for companies to really take supply chain design to another level, right? To really, something that we've talked about in the past is that take it from being kind of a once a year type of engagement to really making it a continuous business process where companies really have to run through all these potential scenarios and model and simulate them so that if and when one of these scenarios actually becomes reality, they've already done the homework up front. They already have some sense of what their impact would be to the supply chain and what actions they should and should not take, in response. Do you see that as well as companies kind of, this becoming much more important, supply chain design, modeling, simulation, all these what if scenarios?
Oh, I think that's, every bit where the industry has led. And I think, a lot of how we position ourselves as a logistics consultant in many respects. I kind of bring this back into the NAFTA context. As an organization, we're a sizable broker here in the U.S. When we look at profiling a lot of our entries, 45% of the entries we do as an organization are somehow affiliated with NAFTA. We look at our cross-border activity, and 90% of that activity has some affiliation with a NAFTA agreement. So, right, you start to change that landscape in any way, shape, or form, it's going to have an impact. And so I think, to your point, understanding or having a contingency plan, or asking those questions about what if are absolutely critical. I think as you think ahead and how to best position yourself organizationally in that light.
Right. Well, I guess we'll find out soon enough, in the weeks and months ahead, in terms of what, how some of the talk, particularly over the past few months, actually translates into what actions in the year ahead. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another, trend, again, that's not necessarily new, but it certainly continues to gain, strength and importance, and that is e-commerce, right? And we saw that yet again over this holiday season, the record growth, the ripple effect that it's had on logistics and on the retail industry and so forth. What are the biggest impacts from your perspective that e-commerce is having on supply chains, and how should, shippers respond moving forward?
Yeah, I think e-commerce is what, clearly it's taken the headlines from a logistics perspective the last year. I think depending on really what aspect of e-commerce you're talking through, I'm sure there's a variety of different challenges, or I think how it evolves from a supply chain. I think parts that I've had some exposure to, around e-commerce. I mean, there's certain parts of it, I guess, in my mind, when I look at under the hood from a logistics perspective, that aren't a whole lot different than the big box retailer. A lot of it today ends in the U.S., or not ends in the U.S., but it circles around a distribution center. And I think the change is, as opposed to me doing distribution from that distribution center into a storefront, the challenge is really that last mile. How do I get it to the end customer in terms of how they're acquiring? I think, the challenge in many respects, if I kind of look at it from a shipper's lens, is I just think the pace of information, right? I think that feedback loop has gotten very quick, whether it's consumer demand, right? So I'm in a virtual marketplace. There's a lot of transparency around pricing. I mean, I kind of, how many times have you been in a big box retailer and you see the person over on their Amazon app or one of the other various ones that are out there? And so I think that feedback loop that shippers and suppliers get today has gotten very quick, and something that, it requires a different sense of, I think being able to flexible, having a certain amount of flexibility in your supply chain and being able to shift, whether that's modally or, again, in some instances, trying to satisfy, kind of that instant gratification, right? I mean, people want to still have the luxury of shopping in their living room, but have that product show up within 24 to 48 hours. And so I think, some of it comes back to, how do you balance your inventory levels in those distribution centers in a way that allows you to support that? So certainly a lot of complexity. I think this is going to be one that will be interesting to see how it continues to unfold. And again, if I'm kind of looking at this back through a shipper's lens a little bit, I think just the importance of technology that starts to play into that equation. And how do you start to really use the data, the analytics, and the information to make better business decisions?
Yeah, that's a great point. That at the end there, particularly when you talk about the inventory side of things, because I think what I'm seeing, at a high level is that, so supply chain has always been about, that balancing, inventory costs with transportation costs, with service levels, right? Labor costs, and all of that is really coming to a head with retail, in the retail industry today with e-commerce, right? Because, it used to be those cost factors, you understood them pretty well, but now it's because of us, the consumers, and our expectation for shorter lead times, and you've got competitive pressures like offering free delivery. Those equations are not as linear and straightforward as it used to be. And now when you have stores that are acting as mini fulfillment centers, the labor costs are kind of, you have to look at it from a different perspective as well. So I think that's where that complexity comes in. I think for a lot of companies, they're still trying to figure out, kind of revisiting that standard supply chain equation and trying to make those trade-offs. And I think it's not that easy.
Yeah. No, it definitely, I think to your point, has its challenges. And, I think, simply ensuring that you've got the right, analytics and data to be able to support some of those decisions become, extremely critical at the end of the day.
Right. And I think, the other aspect from a transportation standpoint, obviously, is which you pointed to, was the last mile delivery. I mean, that's something that, 10 years ago, or maybe even not that long ago, right? It was pretty standard, right? It was FedEx, UPS, United Parcel Service, right? And United States Post Office. Now you have, the likes of Amazon, right? Getting into, final mile delivery. You've got couriers that have always been around, but kind of getting more integrated into the process. You've got the likes of Uber and others, right? So there's a lot going on that front as well that continues to, evolve, and a lot of question marks around that as well.
Yeah, I think the final mile piece is absolutely one that has continued to evolve in that space, and I think we're seeing the importance of that as e-commerce has continued to emerge here, and really gain hold. I mean, I think it's certainly one of those avenues that that's here to stay. I don't see consumer behaviors changing in terms of just where they find those conveniences of again being able to sit in your living room, browsing through items versus trying to get up in here in Minneapolis, fight through the snow and the cold. So it's like I said, I think it's going to be one that will be interesting to be a part of over the next several years as e-commerce continues to take hold, and I think as that industry continues to evolve.
I think the other aspect that I actually saw it more firsthand this year for the first time, that I think is still relatively untapped, is international e-commerce, right? Because historically, shipping parcels and fulfilling consumer orders across borders has been a challenge, particularly in terms of calculating, all the duties and taxes and things like that might be involved as part of the total price when you're shopping. And this year, we did a lot of shopping, as you might expect, via Amazon and other and online as well. And for the first time this year, we actually, some of the things that we ordered actually came from overseas and actually had a customs label on the package, which is something that I hadn't seen before. So I think as consumers have access to international e-commerce sites or sourcing product now from international, that has a ripple effect, to transportation and logistics providers in terms of helping to facilitate that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we felt really through Q4 as a result of it in the international space, and I'll talk a little bit through the air freight lens, volume and demand were very high through Q4. And I think that's a lot of what we saw hitting the marketplace was driven off of the e-commerce, right? And again, trying to satisfy that consumer need to fit it within a short window. And so we saw a lot of, what would be internet related sales that were moving internationally. And I think it absolutely had an impact in the demand equation and what we experienced. And I think it's fair to, again, I guess it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve as we go forward here, because I think it starts to bring together a bit of a fragmented marketplace with a lot of, smaller retailers that now have access to this, again, kind of to the whole theme here, to this global marketplace.
Right. Yeah. To me, and I haven't really looked into it, but my sense is that this is a sign that some of the big guys, namely Amazon and others, are employing drop shipping more often now, or are starting to do that more often. So instead of bringing the product in from China or the UK, which are the two examples in my family's case, they're basically transmitting that order to that supplier in China and that, supplier in the UK, and saying ship it directly, to my consumer, right? As opposed to Amazon bringing it into their fulfillment, networks and fulfilling it from there. So I think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that, moving forward. So let's shift gears again and talk about another trend, that's been kind of highlighted here in the logistics industry. I mean, it seems that for the past couple of years, a new merger and acquisition, is announced in the logistics industry. I mean, do you see M&A activity, remaining strong in 2017, and kind of what are the pros and cons for shippers?
Yeah, I think there were several mergers and acquisitions that were announced last year that were pretty significant in size and scale, and I think we're going to see those, and those are multi-year integration efforts, and I think we'll start to see the effects of those as we get into 2017. I'll maybe circle around some of the steamship lines. Where there was a couple merger / acquisitions, and then of course we touched on the Hanjin bankruptcy and the impact that has had and how it's kind of shooken up the market. But I'd steer maybe less in kind of the merger acquisition as much as what we see in some of these steamship line alliances as a result of some of the consolidation in that space. And I think what as I started to read some of these articles and started to see the magnitude of these alliances. So in the ocean freight industry with the steamship lines, there's three primary alliances that are emerging. And when you look at what those alliances will essentially control on the Trans-Pacific trade, it's about 90%. You look at the Asia to Europe trade, it's about 96%. So you have really three strong entities that have a fair amount of influence on the capacity side of what we see in the marketplace. So if I put my shipper hat on here a little bit, right, the pros are, obviously, through the alliance, you get the greater benefits that obviously it brings as a consumer. It maybe narrows down the number of relationships that you need to be actively managing. But on the con side of it is your choices become limited. And so I think it's natural to maybe think that longer term, that's going to have an impact to your cost to acquire capacity in a future state. But by all accounts, I think, the volatility in the marketplace and just how rapidly things are changing. I think most organizations, again, trying to, spread their wings a little bit in terms of their global presence and how they can gain access into different markets, as well as, I think just the scale that you start to garner and the benefits that come from, growing in scale from a productivity and efficiency perspective. I think those are things that I think are hard to not be attractive in the current environment that we're in today.
Right. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think, particularly in the ocean industry, it's a question of survival, right? Right?
Yeah.
So that's part of the trade-off there. It's like, well, either we come together and align our resources and our networks and remain viable, or we'll end up like Hanjin and or continue to have a depressed environment out there. So I think certainly on the ocean shipping side, that's an area that shippers need to, stay informed about and kind of keep understand what's the dynamics of what's happening in that market and what it means for them from a rate standpoint, from a capacity standpoint, moving forward. Again, going back to our earlier discussion around risk management, right?
Yeah.
And modeling those, those scenarios. We're running short on time here, Matt. Are there any other kind of important trends that companies should keep on their radar? Things that you're looking at that I think shippers ought to be again aware of.
Yeah, obviously, any type of supply chain disruptions, hard to predict, and obviously, I think even harder to plan for in many instances. But probably a couple things that come to mind, and I think they really kind of circle around supply and demand from within the marketplace. And again, I think as we've talked a little bit with some of the volatility, whether it's around where do some of these trade agreements go, what happens with some of these alliances, what happens in the carrier space. So, I think really just keeping tabs on, wherever you're engaged and involved from a market space and where you're procuring capacity, understanding those equations, because they will essentially drive pricing, and we're seeing pricing move a lot faster at a pace than what we maybe have in historical times. And then the other one that I would probably put a little mark out there would be fuel. It's been a bit of a non-factor here the last couple of years. Obviously, we're going into again, we touched on, President-elect Trump and some of the things that are playing out. OPEC's made some statements that they've put out there around managing, production. So I think fuel is definitely one that we can't forget about, and I think one to keep some tabs on, and as we press ahead, because I think fuel. I'll talk maybe a little bit from an airline perspective, because fuel has dropped down. It has made sense for certain carriers to maintain some of the older equipment. So market rates have been able to cover the operating expenses, especially with the all cargo aircraft that's out there today. And so I think if you see fuel, start to ramp up, that could definitely have an impact where those carriers would say, hey, it just doesn't make sense for us to have this capacity in the marketplace, and you start to see some of that come back out. But again, there's a bit of a cyclical thing there, because once you pull the capacity out, the pricing typically goes up, and then maybe it makes sense based on the cost structure to bring it back in. But, I think those would be, really, if I think about, where to focus some energy here, or to make sure you have a good, a strong sense of, is what's happening in that supply and demand side of the equation.
Yeah, no, great. Two great points there. Particularly on the disruption side, because I think that's become the norm, right, in supply chains today.
Oh, yeah.
There's going to be disruptions, whether they're natural disasters that occur, or whether they're man-made things, strikes, or even some of the things that we talked about, with import tariffs and the like. So that could certainly have a ripple effect. And I think it goes back to the point that we talked about before, in terms of really, doing your homework on an ongoing basis and doing that analysis up front, rather than, after the fact. I love the point about fuel. You're right. It wasn't that long ago. I guess it has been a few years now, where we were talking about, oil reaching $200 a barrel, potentially.
Yeah.
And people would design their supply chains, in this era of high oil prices. And we've kind of been spoiled now. It's become kind of a non-factor in some ways, and it really kind of transformed supply chains, because fuel and oil prices kind of became a lesser consideration, relative to other things. But you're right. I think if things happen that, we see the price of oil go above $100 a barrel and even higher, I think that becomes another important factor, moving forward. So Matt, as a way to wrap up, in light of everything that we talked about, and perhaps even some of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about, what action should companies start taking today to make sure that they're adequately prepared to address them?
Adrian, I think it does just simply come back to, how you manage your relationships across your supply chain. And, I think by and large, the supply chain community is a very collaborative community, really focused on, designing solutions that are going to fit your level of risk or your appetite for risk, as well as supporting what your needs are. And so I think the critical element is just ensuring that you've got the right relationships, and that they are collaborative, and that I think to your earlier comment that you're working through some contingency planning and asking a lot of those what if questions that are out there. Because it is, I think, for all practical purposes, a lot of us are kind of just holding on and getting ready for the ride here as we really start to hit 2017. I think to me, it's also, we're very exciting times, when I think about, where the industry has evolved over the course of the last 20 years that I've been a part of it. And I think there's certainly a tremendous amount of opportunity when you think of, just this whole notion of globalization and thinking about this global marketplace that exists. But again, tying it back in, it doesn't, not that there's a risk component that you have to weave in. And like I said, I think the key to helping manage that is ensuring that you have strong relationships across really all aspects that are touching your supply chain.
Yeah, I love that point, because I think you're right. At the end of the day, we talk a lot about collaboration, but don't often walk that talk. And I think it's clear, it's becoming more and more clear each and every year, that going at it alone, it's going to be much more difficult to succeed, right? That you really truly need, to work more, collaboratively, smarter with not only internally, right, breaking down those internal silos that we always talk about, but also externally, whether it's with your logistics service provider partners, your suppliers, and others, to really best address, all these trends that we talked about. Matt, again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe we'll touch base at the end of the year and see how some of these trends that we talked about, actually work their way out in reality. So again, Thank you. And I want to thank those of you that joined us today. If you're watching this episode on demand, either on the Talking Logistics website or the C.H. Robinson website, if you've got a question for Matt, you can post it there, and I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.